people? Multiplier here, and we're looking at kick drums today, all about, I guess, a beginner's guide to kick drums or an introduction to kick drums. So I'm going to explain, loosely speaking, simplifying things a little bit, what a kick drum is in terms of how we make them, and also why they're important, because the two are related. So in fact, let's talk about them all at the same time. So I don't even need to show you what kick drum sounds like, because if you've ever heard any music ever, you know what kick drum sounds like, because, well, it's in every dance music track, and it's actually in every dance music track for a very, very important reason, which I'll explain later with a fun analogy involving dinosaurs. So before we do that, let's actually show you what a kick drum is in terms of the waveform. So let's look at this trap kick, because it's basically more waveform, so it's easier to see what's happening. So if you look at this trap kick, it's basically made up of two halves, a front bit and then a main body bit. So we call the front bit the attack of the sound, and then the main body is just the main body. And if you look at this waveform, you should be able to see visually these two different halves of the sound. So we have the front half happening here, and then we have the rest of it happening all over here. Now, when we ignore all the fancy side stuff of a kick drum, stuff like the reverb, the little bits of noise layers, the distortion, stuff like that, basically a kick drum is a sine wave. Everything else is just fancy stuff around it, but it's basically a sine wave with a pitch envelope. And you can see that here. You can see there's a clean, clear sine wave. So maybe if we zoom in, we can look how smooth that is with the Ableton Live 9.5 waveforms. There is a clean, clear sine wave as the main body, and you can see how the frequencies are more bunched up at the start of the sound. That means that there is a pitch envelope at the start. So we have a main note for our sound that may trail off in the case of a trap kick, but then there's a really sharp pitch envelope happening at the front. That is how a kick drum is composed. Everything else, distortion, reverb, noise layers, other fancy effects, that's just details that give it character, or how you do your envelopes. Maybe you do some frequency modulation, whatever it is, that's just details. The key bit is a kick drum is a sine wave, and there's a body for that sine wave. We can see no matter what kick we have, it does have that main body. In this kick, the main body will be from about here to here. So that's the body of that one. The body of this one is like around here to here. And so when you see that is the body, that is your main low frequency sub bass bit. And then you have the front bit, which is the attack. Kind of making sense? Well, let's dive into some conceptual stuff to explain why this is important. And now we know the kicks are made of two halves. Why are these two halves important? Well, if we look at the first bit, well, basically what a kick drum is, it's defining a moment in time. So when a kick drum hits, it's going kapow! This is a moment in time. And then when a kick drum hits again, it's going kapow! This moment in time, and so on. So it's all these different moments in time. And then what this allows you to do is put other rhythmic elements in there, or do other musical things to create a rhythm. And it's this rhythm that can get people dancing. But there's a subtler point to that, because you could create a rhythm with just some shakers and a bit of a snare and a bit of a triangle instrument, and that would still be a rhythm. But if you played that in a club, no one would move. And that's because the other part of a kick, the body, which is the low end weight of your kick, is needed to actually get people moving. And there's an important reason for that involving dinosaurs. So back in the olden days, when there were dinosaurs flying about like rah! And all that kind of stuff, there was velociraptors, T-Rexes, woolly mammoths, and so on, we didn't really hear sub-frequencies really ever. I mean, we heard them sometimes, like when there was danger, like thunder, earthquakes, lions, all that kind of good stuff. And it's the fact that we only ever heard them in dangerous situations that meant that biologically we ended up responding to this in a visceral way. So we physically respond on a chemical level to low end, because back in the olden days, we only ever heard sub bass when there was danger. So now when we have function one speakers and cars with dope speaker systems and all that good stuff, we can create sub bass whenever we want, but chemically and biologically, we still respond viscerally on an animal level to sub bass. And that's why you can have a kick drum with a really good attack that defines a moment in time. But if it doesn't have the body, if you play it in the club, people can still hear the rhythm of the song, but they won't instinctively move. It's tried and tested. If you want people to move and physically respond intuitively and instinctively to a beat of a track and then feel the rhythm and actually start physically moving, it's got to have that low end. So the two components of the kick serve different functions, basically. The first bit very specifically defines the moment in time. The attack, you can hear that through all speaker systems. And then the low end, that main body, is the thing that viscerally gets people moving, and it's the thing they respond to. And that's why you need your low end to work probably more so than the attack, to be honest, although the attack needs to work for another reason that I'll explain. So the low end basically needs to be doing the right things if you want people to move physically in the club or the raves, or just respond to it, or dance in their room with doing whatever. It's all fine. If you want people to dance, you've got to have your low end working because of dinosaurs and thunders and earthquakes and stuff. That makes sense? Hopefully it made sense. And there's one other tiny little detail about the attack that's important. So the attack not only defines a moment in time in a way that you can hear easily, it covers some high frequencies, it's the click you may have heard some people call it as. It also gives you the punch. So it's that pitch envelope at the start of the sound that gives you the punch. So, I mean, let's give you an example with Operator to show you how it's basically that pitch envelope that goes through those frequencies like 200 hertz, 250 hertz, 150 hertz. It gives you that punch. It's that thing that hits you in the chest. That low end alone, if you didn't have that pitch envelope, would still sound like a thump in a club, in the sense that it would still define a beat, but it wouldn't physically punch you, so it wouldn't hit as hard. So let's give you a very quick example involving Operator in an overly simplified situation. So Operator is basically just a simple FM synth built into the Suite version of Ableton. So if we fix the frequency of this oscillator, pitch it down to... Oh, I have soloed the wrong channel, this one. So let's turn up the level so we can hear it. Sweet, sounding good. Not really. So we basically define the frequency for our kick drum. This is defining the body of our kick drum. Let's say we like that one. Now we could do some sort of envelope thing to determine the tail, or compress it later. So you see how with all these different kick drums, there's a different shape for the tail. That's purely a result of either setting up your envelopes initially, or distorting it, or compressing it dynamically. That's all your later off stuff. That doesn't really matter. You can always do that later. Simplistically, we have basically the body happening now. Nice and sweet. So, I mean, if you play that in a club, maybe with a bit of a tail, it might be more obvious. Cool. So sounding a bit like a kick. Sweet, nice, but it's not hitting you very hard. So we need to add some pitch envelope at the start of that sound. So if we turn on this pitch envelope thing, crank up the initial and the peak to the max, and then dial in this envelope setting and then the decay, this shape here will be the pitch envelope. So by dialing this in, you can see how this starts to give your kick a bit of punch. So it's dialing in this setting here and the decay time as well. That's the idea. See how suddenly it has a bit of punch? It still has that low end thump that you would basically the big speakers in the club will play. But notice the difference is I turn the pitch envelope on and off. See how it's that pitch envelope that suddenly makes it a kick and not just a bass sound? That's the key idea. Naturally, you'd have to do a million bits of processing afterwards. You want to do some distortion, some reverb, add in some noise layers, maybe some other percussive layers on top. Do some fancy things to result in a cool sound. But that is the root of it all. It is a sine wave with a pitch envelope, and everything else is just personal preference. And you can see that if you have a look at these different waveforms as an example, we can see that things like the envelope we use is just purely a matter of preference and how we want to design the kick, and how long we want that pitch envelope at the start to take is, again, just down to personal preference. You can see in the case of this kick here and this kick here, the pitch envelope is roughly this amount of time. Whereas if you look at this kick below, this 14, the pitch envelope happens incredibly quickly right at the start of the sound. You have to zoom in a lot further to see the effect of that. So you can see it happens, in the case of this kick 19 from my sample pack, it happens literally over, I suppose it's slightly tailing off here, but most of that pitch envelope is happening right over this tiny period. Whereas this trap kick, it happens over a longer period of time. So that's just dialing it into taste. But that is the idea, and that is how kick drums work. So yeah, if you already knew that, and maybe you're a little bit more advanced, and you're thinking, right, cool, or maybe you're a beginner, but you've just learned this, and you're thinking, how do I go to the next level? Now that you know the basics of how a kick is made in terms of it's a sine wave, or some form of envelope with a bit of pitch envelope at the start, how do we then make a cool and interesting kick drum? Well, that's just experimentation basically pretty much any effect you can imagine, you can probably add to a kick drum one way or another to make it interesting. But some common ways you can make your kicks nice and good is saturation or distortion, coloring, driving, exciting. It's all the same things. Adding in harmonics or thickening things up or distorting your kick. That's one way of thickening it up and making it sound a bit chunkier, a bit warmer, a bit nicer. Also, you can do things like adding in bits of reverb, whether it's convolution reverb or gated normal reverb, small room reverb, big room reverb, add what you want. Add in a bit of that, maybe add in some noise layers or some cool sounds, some Foley sounds. Foley sounds are real life sounds that you mix in quietly. Just basically add in anything cool and keep manipulating it, keep doing things until it basically sounds cool. But it all starts off with that simple sine wave of a pitch envelope. Then it's just details. One important thing I want to basically get more people doing is looking at the waveforms as well. Just like how when you're looking at surfboards in a surfboard shot, the first thing you do, you give it a rub, you give it a feel. You want to feel like how the rail is like pinched in or how the concave or the V bottom is doing whatever it's doing. You want to be able to physically look at the surfboard. You don't just go, sweet surfboard, bro, and then buy it. You actually feel it. You want to see the details. So when you're looking at kick drums, you want to look at the waveforms and look quite specifically at what's happening and also try and hear critically as well. So when you're looking at this waveform, you can see what's happening to the dynamics. So if you look at, say, this kick here, it starts off, but then it goes down and then it comes back up and then it goes back in. Whereas this kick drum here starts off and goes down and in and off in a different way. So each kick drum will have its own character, its own way of doing things. But the more you look at kick drums and then the more you listen to them, and you can basically correlate what you're seeing with your eyes with what you're hearing and analyzing, and it'll all start to make a lot of sense. So that's something as well that's, I think, quite important. And as a weird little super bonus side note, because I'm just full of useful information today, by default, whenever you drag out kick drums as audio clips like you have here, so let's drag out, say, this one, by default, if we look at the fades, so this drop-down menu fades, it will add a fade at the start of the sound, which is like 4 milliseconds or so, and that's losing a bit of the attack. So at a glance, you think, cool, my kick drum is fine, it's still sounding okay. But when you actually zoom in, you can see that you've lost that little bit of the attack. So we need to pull this fade, and then we get that, basically pull the fade back, and we get that front bit of the attack there. So just a little side detail, whenever we're working with kicks as audio files, and you're new to Ableton, you need to just bear in mind that it might add a fade by default. So just hop into fades and remove it. For most audio clips, it's fine. But in the case of kicks, that front bit of the sound is super important and we can't afford to lose even 4 milliseconds or so. And sweet, there you go. That is an introduction to kicks. Now, if you need some kicks because, well, you're making dance music, I have a kicks pack out with Splice that came out recently, Splice Sounds. Links in that below. And it's basically 99 pretty sweet kicks. So the first half of them are more normal, functional kicks. And then the last half are more processed, experimental, bit more interesting kicks if you want to go off on a weird tangent. So to give you a flavor. You get the idea. There's some pretty cool ones. Like I did some pretty experimental stuff near the end. Love that little dude. Anyway, you get the idea. Lots of sweet kicks. Check it out. And yeah, hope you learned something. I've been Multiplier. Hope you enjoyed.